A 68-year-old man sits across from a financial advisor, staring at a retirement account that's smaller than he expected, and asks the exact same question thousands of people ask every single year: where did I go wrong? I earned good money my whole life. The advisor doesn't say anything shocking, doesn't reveal some secret stock tip, she simply explains one formula, a formula this man could have used at 25, and his face changes the moment he finally understands it. My name is Cole, and on this channel we take confusing money formulas and break them down clearly, so if that sounds useful, stick around and consider subscribing. Most people spend their entire financial lives obsessing over one single variable, income, believing that earning more money is the master key that unlocks wealth automatically. But here's where things get interesting, because plenty of high earners retire with almost nothing, while plenty of modest earners retire quietly comfortable. And that contradiction only makes sense once you realize income was never actually the formula, it was just one small piece of it. So here's the real question hiding underneath this mystery: what is the actual formula that determines whether someone builds real wealth over their lifetime, and why do so many people only discover it decades too late? The answer isn't complicated, but it requires understanding four specific variables working together, not one variable working alone. The first variable is income, and yes, it matters, but only as the starting ingredient rather than the whole recipe. Income simply determines how much raw material exists to work with, nothing more, meaning two people with identical incomes can end up in completely different financial positions depending entirely on what happens to that income after it arrives. The second variable, and the one most people underestimate the most, is savings rate, the percentage of that income actually kept rather than spent. This is where the formula starts revealing its true power, because savings rate, not income, determines how much raw fuel actually enters the wealth-building engine each month, regardless of how large or small that engine happens to be. Picture two engines of completely different sizes, one massive and powerful, one modest and small, but only one of them actually gets fuel poured into it regularly, while the other sits mostly empty despite its impressive size. The smaller engine running consistently will eventually travel further than the larger one that mostly sits idle, and this is exactly why modest earners with strong saving habits often outpace high earners who save very little. Here's where the mystery deepens further, because even income multiplied by savings rate isn't the full formula yet. There's a third variable working quietly in the background: investment return. Money that simply sits in a savings account grows slowly, often barely outpacing inflation, while money invested consistently over time benefits from growth compounding on top of itself, transforming modest contributions into substantially larger sums. This is exactly why two people saving identical amounts can end up with dramatically different results, one keeping their savings uninvested, watching it grow sluggishly, while the other invests consistently, watching growth accelerate as their balance compounds year after year. The formula isn't just about keeping money, it's about putting that kept money to work. But here's the variable that changes absolutely everything, the one most people discover far too late: time. Time isn't just another ingredient sitting alongside the others, it's the multiplier that determines how powerful everything else actually becomes, because compound growth needs years, often decades, to fully reveal its potential. Think about planting a tree. The sapling looks nearly identical whether you plant it early or late, barely noticeable for the first several years regardless of timing. But the tree planted decades earlier eventually towers over the one planted later, not because it received more care or better soil, simply because it had more time to grow, and this is precisely why starting early matters so much more than most people ever realize. This naturally leads to the full formula finally coming together: wealth isn't simply income, it's savings rate multiplied by investment return, compounded relentlessly across time. Someone who understands all four variables working together, even with modest income, often builds more wealth than someone earning dramatically more while ignoring savings rate, investment returns, or the critical importance of starting early. Here's where the psychological shift really begins, because once you see this formula clearly, the pressure to simply earn more money starts feeling less urgent, replaced by a much more actionable question: am I actually using every variable available to me? Someone stuck chasing a bigger salary might be completely neglecting savings rate, investment consistency, or the time they've already wasted waiting for some perfect future moment to finally begin. This is also where identity quietly enters the picture, because many people build their entire sense of financial progress around income alone, celebrating raises and promotions while completely ignoring whether that extra money is actually being captured through savings and investing. A bigger paycheck feels like obvious progress, but without the other three variables working alongside it, that progress often evaporates before it ever becomes genuine wealth. But here's an uncomfortable truth worth naming honestly: the reason so many people discover this formula too late isn't because it was hidden or complicated, it's because the early years of using it feel almost invisible. Someone in their 20s saving consistently and investing modestly sees very little dramatic progress for years, while someone chasing promotions and bigger paychecks sees immediate, visible results, making income feel like the obviously superior strategy in the short term. Consider two people starting their careers at the same age. One focuses entirely on climbing the income ladder while barely saving or investing anything, while the other earns considerably less but saves a meaningful percentage consistently, investing it from day one and never stopping. 30 years later, despite the income gap between them, the second person frequently ends up with dramatically more wealth, simply because time had decades to work on their behalf while the other person's progress depended entirely on income that eventually plateaus. There's a specific number worth pausing on, because it shows exactly how much time actually matters within this formula. Someone who invests $500 a month starting at age 25, earning a reasonable long-term average return, can end up with a dramatically larger sum by retirement than someone who invests the exact same amount starting at age 35, even though the second person only started a decade later. That single decade of delay often costs hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time retirement arrives, not because the later starter did anything wrong, simply because they handed the multiplier fewer years to work with. This is exactly why financial advisors so often emphasize starting early, even with tiny amounts, over waiting until income feels sufficiently comfortable to begin. Someone who starts investing $50 a month at 22, gradually increasing that amount as income grows, frequently ends up ahead of someone who waits until their 30s to start with a much larger amount, because time spent invested matters more than the size of the initial contribution. It's worth naming this specific mistake that traps so many people inside this formula for years without realizing it: waiting for the perfect moment to begin. People often tell themselves they'll start investing once they earn more, once debt is paid off, once life feels a little less chaotic, but that perfect moment rarely arrives cleanly, and every year spent waiting is a year the multiplier never got to use on their behalf. Consider how savings rate and investment return interact with each other in ways that amplify small differences into massive outcomes over time. Someone saving 15% of their income and investing it consistently will often end up with substantially more wealth than someone saving only 5%, even if their incomes are identical, because that extra 10%, compounding for decades, eventually represents far more than simple arithmetic would initially suggest. There's also a common trap worth naming honestly: mistaking a high income for financial progress, without checking whether savings rate and investment consistency are actually keeping pace. Someone who receives a substantial raise but continues spending nearly everything they earn hasn't actually improved their position within this formula at all, because income only matters once it's captured through saving and investing rather than absorbed entirely into lifestyle. This is precisely why two people with completely different salaries can end up in remarkably similar financial positions later in life, and why two people with identical salaries can end up worlds apart. The formula doesn't care how much someone earns in isolation, it cares how much of that income gets captured, invested, and given enough time to grow, which explains why income alone has never been a reliable predictor of who actually builds lasting wealth. So let's return to that 68-year-old man staring at a retirement account smaller than he expected. He didn't fail because he earned too little, he failed because he spent decades focused on only 1/4 of the actual formula, chasing income while ignoring savings rate, investment returns, and the irreplaceable value of time that was quietly slipping away the entire time he waited to start. Once you understand this formula clearly, income is the starting material, savings rate is the fuel, investment return is the engine, and time is the multiplier that determines everything, the path forward becomes far clearer than chasing a bigger paycheck ever could. You'll never look at your own income the same way again, because now you know it was never really the formula, it was only ever one piece of it. Subscribe.